The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Veltar's crystalline form shifted colors from deep blue to warning amber. 24 students from across the galaxy sat frozen in their seats, each one processing what they had just heard. The final assignment for advanced xenobiology would take place on Kepler 442b, a world so dangerous that even saying its name made most species uncomfortable. Sarah Chen adjusted her position in the back row, her human eyes scanning the faces around her. The ethereal students had dimmed their gaseous forms until they were barely visible. The rock-like Korthak delegation sat motionless, their usual confident rumbling reduced to nervous whispers. Even the proud Velkari, with their superior intellect and advanced technology, looked shaken. The mission parameters are straightforward, Professor Veltar continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. You will spend 72 hours on the surface conducting a comprehensive biological survey. Our environmental suits can maintain life support for exactly that duration, before catastrophic failure becomes inevitable. A Mentari student raised one of her forearms. Professor, what is the survival rate for previous expeditions to Class 12 Death Worlds? The crystal being's form flickered through several colors before settling on a dull gray. There have been no previous expeditions to worlds of this classification. The Academy considers them too dangerous for scientific study. The silence stretched longer this time. Sarah could hear the nervous breathing of a dozen different species, each one calculating the odds of survival in their own way. The environmental data streaming across the holographic display made for grim reading. Surface temperatures ranging from -40 to 60 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric pressure 3 times galactic standard. An atmosphere composed primarily of methane and hydrogen sulfide. Electrical storms that could fry most known technology. However, Professor Veltar added, this assignment is entirely voluntary. Those who choose not to participate will complete an alternative research project from the safety of the Academy's archives. More silence. Sarah watched as her classmates exchanged glances. The glitch student near the front was vibrating with anxiety, his technological components sparking occasionally. The amphibious Hydran delegation had retreated into their protective shells. Even Zixth, the brilliant Velkari who topped every academic ranking, kept his 3 eyes fixed firmly on his desk. Sarah thought about her childhood on Kepler 438b, where winter mornings regularly hit -60 degrees and summer afternoons could melt metal. She remembered learning to repair equipment during ion storms that would shut down most galactic technology for weeks. The other students saw Kepler 442b as an impossible challenge. Sarah saw it as Tuesday. I need volunteers, Professor Veltar announced. The mission requires a minimum of 1 participant to gather meaningful data. The seconds ticked by. Sarah counted her heartbeats, a habit she had developed during long survival exercises on her home colony. 100 beats. 200. Still no one moved. She looked around the room again. These were supposed to be the galaxy's best and brightest, students who had competed against millions of others for the privilege of attending the Academy. Future scientists, explorers, and leaders who would shape the next 1,000 years of galactic civilization. But right now, they looked like frightened children. Sarah raised her hand. The reaction was immediate. Every head in the room turned toward her. The ethereal students brightened with shock. Zixth's 3 eyes widened until they covered half his face. Even Professor Veltar's crystalline form went completely transparent for a moment, a sign of extreme surprise in his species. Miss Chen, the professor said slowly, are you certain you understand the parameters of this assignment? Yes, sir, Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. 72 hours on Kepler 442b conducting biological surveys. Standard Academy equipment. Full scientific protocols. A Korthak student named Thrum turned his massive rocky head toward her. Human, you realize this is not a simulation. The environmental conditions will kill most life forms within hours. Sarah nodded. I understand the risks. The atmospheric composition alone would dissolve your respiratory system, added a Velkari student. The pressure differentials would crush your internal organs. The temperature variations would cause immediate cellular death. That's why we have environmental suits, Sarah said simply. Zixth leaned forward, his intelligent eyes studying her face. Sarah, you are one of the most promising students in our cohort. Why would you risk your life for an academic exercise? Sarah considered the question. How could she explain that what they called a death world was just another word for home to a human? How could she make them understand that every human colony existed in conditions that would terrify most galactic species? Because someone needs to do it, she said finally, and because knowledge is worth the risk. Professor Veltar's form cycled through several colors before settling on a deep purple that indicated serious contemplation. Miss Chen, I must inform you that the Academy cannot guarantee your safety. Our insurance protocols do not cover expeditions to Class 12 worlds. If something goes wrong, rescue operations may not be possible. I understand. The equipment we can provide has never been tested in these specific conditions. Failure rates could be significantly higher than projected. I understand. You would be completely alone on the surface. No backup, no support team. Just you and whatever supplies we can transport down. Sarah smiled for the first time since the assignment had been announced. Professor, I've been alone on worse worlds than this one. The classroom erupted in whispers. Students leaned toward each other, sharing their disbelief in a dozen different languages. The human was either incredibly brave or completely insane. Possibly both. Professor Veltar raised one crystalline appendage for silence. Very well, Miss Chen. You have 48 hours to prepare. Report to equipment distribution at 800 tomorrow for gear assignment. Medical will need a complete physical and psychological evaluation. And, he paused, his form flickering uncertain colors. Perhaps you should contact your family. Standard protocols require next-of-kin notification for high-risk assignments. As the class was dismissed, Sarah gathered her things slowly. She could feel the stares of her classmates, could hear their continued whispers. Some sounded worried. Others sounded impressed. A few sounded like they thought she was walking to her death. Sixth approached as she reached the door. Sarah, I need to ask you something. She paused, looking up at the tall Velkari. What? Are you doing this to prove something about humans? About how tough your species is compared to the rest of us? Sarah considered the question seriously. It would be easy to say yes to claim she was defending human honor or showing off human superiority, but that wasn't the truth. No, she said finally. I'm doing it because it's interesting. Because we might learn something important. And because, she paused, thinking about how to explain it. Because running away from difficult things isn't how you learn about them. Zix's three eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep thought in his species. That is either wisdom or madness, Sarah grinned. On my world, we call that Tuesday. As she walked down the corridor toward her dormitory, Sarah pulled out her communication device to send a message home. Her parents would worry, but they would also understand. After all, they had raised her on a world that most of the galaxy considered uninhabitable. Behind her, the classroom continued to buzz with conversation. Professor Veltar stood at his podium, staring at the door where the human had exited. In 300 years of teaching, he had never had a student volunteer for certain death. The truly disturbing part was that the human had seemed genuinely excited about it. Sarah stood in Equipment Distribution Bay 7, watching as Pip, the nervous glitch quartermaster, checked and double-checked his inventory lists. His mechanical components whirred and clicked as he moved between storage units, gathering the gear that was supposed to keep her alive on Kepler 442b. Environmental suit. Mark 12, Pip announced, his voice crackling through his vocal processors. Rated for Class 10 atmospheric conditions. Maximum exposure time 72 hours, he paused, his optical sensors focusing on Sarah. Though I should mention, it's never been tested on a Class 12 world. Sarah examined the suit. It was impressive by galactic standards, packed with technology that represented centuries of advancement. Climate control systems, atmospheric processors, radiation shielding, emergency medical systems. But as she looked closer, she noticed problems. The temperature regulation seemed designed for species that operated within a narrow comfort zone. Humans had evolved to handle much wider temperature swings. The atmospheric processors were calibrated for beings who breathed different gas mixtures than humans needed. The emergency medical systems included drugs that might help other species but could poison human biology. What about backup systems? Sarah asked. Pip's optical sensors dimmed slightly. The suit is the backup system. Academy protocols assume that if the environmental suit fails, immediate evacuation is the only option. Sarah nodded, making mental notes. She had grown up with equipment that broke regularly and needed constant improvisation to keep working. Her parents had taught her to assume any piece of technology would fail at the worst possible moment. Emergency rations, Pip continued, producing a container of standardized nutrition blocks. 72 hours worth of balanced galactic nutrition. Sarah picked up one of the blocks and sniffed it. The smell was wrong immediately. Sweet where human food should be savory, with chemical undertones that made her stomach turn. She bit off a small piece and chewed thoughtfully. "These are going to make me sick," she said matter-of-factly. Pip's mechanical head tilted. "The nutrition blocks are formulated to support 97% of known galactic species. Humans must be in the other 3%. I don't have alternative rations available," Sarah shrugged. "I'll figure something out." The rest of the equipment followed the same pattern. Scientific instruments calibrated for sensory ranges different from human perception. Communication devices that transmitted on frequencies human vocal cords couldn't produce. Emergency tools designed for appendages and gripping strength unlike human hands. As Pip finished the inventory, Sarah realized the Academy's universal equipment wasn't universal at all. It was designed by and for the established galactic species. Humans were too new, too different, too primitive to have been considered in the design process. "Miss Chen," Pip said hesitantly, "perhaps you should reconsider this assignment. The equipment, it's not really designed for your species." "I noticed," Sarah said. "Don't worry about it. Humans are good at making things work." After leaving equipment distribution, Sarah made her way to the Academy's library. She had research to do, but not the kind her professors would expect. While her classmates would be studying the theoretical dangers of Kepler 442b, Sarah was looking for practical solutions. She found Zixth in the library's main study area, surrounded by holographic displays showing atmospheric composition charts and geological surveys. His three eyes moved independently as he processed multiple data streams simultaneously. "Sarah," he said without looking up, "I've been running probability calculations. Even with perfect equipment function, your survival chances are less than 12%. "That seems high," Sarah said, settling into a nearby chair. Zixth's eyes snapped toward her. "High? You consider a 12% survival rate optimistic? Humans have survived worse odds. When? Where? What historical examples support this claim?" Sarah thought about how to explain human history to someone whose species had achieved spaceflight without ever experiencing a major war, natural disaster, or resource shortage. The Velkari had evolved on a garden world with stable climate, abundant resources, and no natural predators. Their biggest historical challenge had been deciding which of 17 different mathematical systems to use for their first star charts. "Well," Sarah said, "there was this time about 600 years ago, when some humans got stuck on an island continent with no supplies, no communication, and hostile native life forms. They were supposed to be there for 6 months. The supply ships got destroyed in a war. No rescue came for 3 years. What happened to them? They built a civilization. By the time rescue arrived, they had farms, cities, and a functioning government. They didn't want to leave." Zixth's middle eye blinked rapidly, a sign of confusion. "That seems improbable." Or there was the Mars colony disaster. Equipment failure stranded 800 people on a planet with no breathable atmosphere, no liquid water, and regular radiation storms that could kill you in minutes. They were supposed to last maybe a week with their emergency supplies. And 30 years later, Mars was one of the most successful human colonies in the system. They had figured out how to extract water from the soil, grow food in radiation-proof greenhouses, and build cities underground. Zixth stared at her with all three eyes. "Your species treats survival disasters as construction projects?" "More or less," a new voice interrupted their conversation. "That's absolutely fascinating." Sarah turned to see Oren, one of the Mentari students, approaching their table. The tall, graceful being moved with the fluid precision of his species, his forearms gesturing expressively as he spoke. "I've been researching human colony worlds," Oren continued. "According to galactic classification systems, every single human settlement exists on what we would consider a death world. Every single one. That's not exactly," Sarah started to say, then stopped. Actually, Oren was right. Humans had never successfully colonized a garden world. Every human planet had some combination of extreme weather, dangerous wildlife, toxic atmosphere, or geological instability that would terrify most galactic species. "Your homeworld, Kepler 4938b, Oren went on, is classified as a Class 11 death world. You grew up there. You attended primary school there. You played childhood games there. Yeah, so? So you're worried about spending 72 hours on a Class 12 world when you spent 18 years on a Class 11 world. Zixth's eyes widened again. Sarah, why didn't you mention this during the class discussion? Sarah shrugged. It didn't seem relevant. Besides, 438b isn't that bad once you get used to it. Not that bad. Oren pulled up a holographic display showing Kepler 438b's environmental data. Atmospheric pressure 4 times galactic standard. Gravity 1.9 times normal. Daily temperature variations of over 100 degrees. Volcanic activity. Seismic instability. Ion storms that last for weeks. The ion storms are actually kind of pretty, Sarah said, and they're great for testing equipment durability. Zixth leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to something between admiration and horror. Sarah, I need to ask you something honestly. Do humans understand that these worlds are dangerous? Sarah considered the question. Of course we understand they're dangerous. That's why we're so careful about safety protocols, equipment redundancy, and emergency planning. When you grow up expecting your life support to fail, you get really good at fixing things. But you don't avoid the danger. How can you avoid it? Everywhere humans go, there's danger. If we avoided every dangerous place, we'd never leave our homes. And even our homes are dangerous by galactic standards. Oren and Zixth exchanged looks. The Mentari's philosophical nature was clearly struggling with the concept of embracing danger instead of avoiding it. The Velkari's analytical mind was trying to process survival strategies that didn't rely on superior technology. Sarah, Oren said slowly, what would happen if a Mentari tried to live on your home world? Without proper equipment and training? You'd die in about 6 hours. And what would happen if you tried to live on our home world? Sarah thought about the Mentari homeworld. Stable climate, no dangerous weather, abundant food, no natural predators, perfectly breathable atmosphere. I'd probably get really bored. That evening, Sarah sat in her dormitory room disassembling and modifying her assigned equipment. She had spent years learning to adapt galactic technology for human use, and the skills were serving her well now. Her roommate, a shy aquatic named Glub, watched nervously as Sarah rewired the environmental suit's temperature controls and adjusted the atmospheric processor settings. Are you sure you should be changing academy equipment? Glub asked, her gills fluttering with anxiety. I'm sure I'll die if I don't change it, Sarah replied, carefully rerouting power connections. This suit was designed for species that live in climate-controlled environments. I need it to work when everything else fails. But what if the modifications don't work? Sarah looked up from her work. Then I'll improvise something else. That's what humans do. As she worked late into the night, Sarah thought about her classmates' reactions. They saw Kepler 442b as an impossible challenge. She saw it as a slightly more difficult version of home. The difference, she realized, wasn't in their respective capabilities. It was in their expectations. Her classmates expected the universe to be safe and predictable. When it wasn't, they relied on Technolo. The transport shuttle shuddered as it entered Kepler 442b's upper atmosphere. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of atmospheric entry, the slight shift in gravity as they descended toward the surface. Through the viewport, she could see the planet's surface emerging from the cloud cover like something from a nightmare. The landscape below was a patchwork of volcanic activity and chemical storms. Lightning arced between the clouds in patterns that defied meteorological understanding. The ground itself seemed to shift and writhe as geological forces reshaped the terrain in real time. Final approach to landing zone, announced the shuttle pilot, a professional ethereal whose gaseous form flickered with nervous energy. Surface conditions are extreme. We have a 12-minute window for deployment before the next storm system arrives. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. The environmental suit felt bulky and unfamiliar compared to the gear she had grown up with, but her modifications seemed to be holding. The scientific instruments were calibrated and ready. The emergency rations were secured, though she had supplemented them with some food concentrates from her personal supply. You still have time to change your mind, the pilot said, his voice carrying the universal concern of someone who had transported too many researchers to dangerous worlds. The Academy would understand if you decided this mission was too risky. I'm good, Sarah replied, sealing her helmet. Just get me to the surface. The shuttle touched down with more force than usual, the pilot fighting to maintain control in the planet's chaotic weather patterns. Through the viewport, Sarah could see the landing zone, a relatively flat area between two active volcanic vents, chosen because it offered temporary shelter from the worst of the electrical storms. Deployment in 30 seconds, the pilot announced. Remember, we cannot maintain position in these conditions. Pickup is scheduled for exactly 72 hours from now. At coordinates you'll receive via emergency beacon. If you're not at the pickup point when we arrive. We cannot wait. Understood. The shuttle's cargo door opened, and Sarah stepped onto the surface of Kepler 442b. The pilot was already lifting off before her feet touched the ground, unwilling to risk his ship in the planet's hostile environment any longer than absolutely necessary. Sarah stood alone on an alien world that could kill her, in a dozen different ways. The first thing she noticed was the heat. Even through her environmental suit's climate control, she could feel the surface temperature radiating up from the ground. The volcanic activity kept the local area at nearly 60 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cause equipment failure in most galactic technology. The second thing she noticed was that her suit's cooling system was already struggling. Sarah smiled. This was going to be interesting. She activated her scientific instruments and began the first phase of her survey. The biological scanners immediately detected life signs, which was encouraging. The atmospheric analyzers confirmed the presence of methane and hydrogen sulfide, as expected. The geological sensors painted a picture of a world in constant geological flux. Then the first equipment failure occurred. Her primary atmospheric processor began cycling irregularly, struggling to maintain proper gas mixture in her suit. Sarah checked the readouts and realized the problem immediately. The processor had been designed for stable environmental conditions, not the fluctuating chemical composition of Kepler 442b's atmosphere. She had been on the surface for exactly 17 minutes. Instead of panicking, Sarah pulled out her emergency repair kit and began implementing the first of many modifications she would need to survive. She rerouted the processor's intake valves, adjusted the filtration settings, and bypassed two safety systems that were causing unnecessary shutdowns. The fix took 12 minutes and used half of her emergency repair supplies, but it worked. As she continued her survey, Sarah began to understand why the Academy considered this world so dangerous. Every piece of equipment was pushed beyond its design specifications. The electrical storms interfered with communication systems. The chemical atmosphere corroded metal components. The temperature variations caused thermal stress that led to cascading system failures. But Sarah had grown up with equipment failures. On Kepler 438b, a day without something breaking was considered unusual. Her parents had taught her to assume every system would fail, and to always have 3 different ways to accomplish any critical task. By the end of her first day, Sarah had jury-rigged 17 different repairs, recalibrated her scientific instruments 4 times, and improvised a shelter from volcanic rock and her emergency supplies. Her equipment bore no resemblance to what she had started with, but everything was still functioning. More importantly, she was gathering incredible data. The microbial life on Kepler 442b was unlike anything in the galactic databases. The organisms had adapted to the extreme conditions in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about biochemistry. Some thrived in the acidic hot springs around the volcanic vents. Others seemed to feed directly on electrical energy from the lightning storms. But the most interesting discovery came on her second day, when Sarah's modified scanners detected artificial structures buried beneath the volcanic sediment. She spent hours carefully excavating the site, using improvised tools when her standard equipment proved inadequate. What she found changed everything she thought she knew about Kepler 442b. The structures were clearly artificial, but they weren't built by any species currently known to galactic science. The materials were advanced composites that had somehow survived the planet's hostile environment for what appeared to be decades or possibly centuries. More importantly, they weren't empty. Sarah's scanners detected preserved biological samples, data storage devices, and what appeared to be scientific equipment. This wasn't just a random crash site. This was a research expedition, one that had been sent to study Kepler 442b long before the Academy had even classified it as a death world. The data storage devices were damaged but recoverable. Using techniques she had learned from salvaging equipment on Kepler 438b, Sarah managed to extract partial information from the corrupted memory banks. What she found horrified her. The expedition had been from the Hegemony's research division, sent to Kepler 442b 67 years ago. But according to the recovered data, Kepler 442b hadn't been a death world when they arrived. It had been a garden world, rich with life and perfectly suited for scientific study. The research team had been conducting terraforming experiments, trying to develop new techniques for making hostile worlds more habitable. Their work had focused on atmospheric modification and biological adaptation. According to their records, the initial results had been promising. Then something had gone catastrophically wrong. Sarah spent hours piecing together the fragmented data files. The picture that emerged was one of scientific hubris and unintended consequences. The terraforming experiments had triggered a cascade of environmental changes that transformed the garden world into the death world she now stood on. The acidic microbial life hadn't evolved naturally. It was the result of experimental organisms released into the environment. The electrical storms were caused by atmospheric modifications that had destabilized the planet's weather patterns. The volcanic activity had been triggered by deep core drilling that had disrupted geological stability. Every danger on Kepler 442b had been created by galactic civilizations' attempt to make worlds safer and more habitable. As Sarah processed this information, her communication array finally achieved a stable connection with the orbiting research vessel. She had been out of contact for over 48 hours, and she could hear the relief in the comm officer's voice when her signal appeared. Research Team Alpha, this is Academy Vessel Bright Horizon. Please report your status immediately. Bright Horizon, this is Research Team Alpha, Sarah replied. I'm alive, I'm healthy, and I've made some discoveries you need to hear. Team Alpha, we were prepared to initiate emergency evacuation procedures. Your last communication suggested equipment failure. Sarah looked around at her improvised shelter, her jury-rigged equipment, and her collection of samples from what had once been a paradise world. There have been some equipment modifications, but everything is functional. I'm requesting an extension of my surface time. Silence on the channel. Then, Team Alpha, did you just request to stay longer on Kepler 442b? That's correct. I found evidence of a previous expedition and recovered data that changes our understanding of this world's history. I need more time to conduct a complete survey. Team Alpha, your scheduled pickup is in 18 hours. Academy protocols require immediate evacuation at that time. Sarah considered arguing, then decided to wait. The data she had already recovered would be enough to shock the Academy leadership. Once they understood what she had found, they would authorize additional missions. But those missions would need to be conducted differently. They would need personnel who could adapt to hostile environments, who could survive when technology failed, who could thrive in conditions that terrified most galactic species. They would need humans. As Sarah settled down for her final night on Kepler 442b, she watched the electrical storms paint the sky in colors that had no names. Tomorrow, the Academy's main auditorium had never been so quiet. 300 of the galaxy's most brilliant minds sat in absolute silence as Professor Veltar's crystalline form shifted through colors that indicated extreme distress. The emergency faculty meeting had been called within hours of Sarah's return from Kepler 442b, and the preliminary data she had transmitted was causing chaos in the academic community. Sarah stood at the podium, still wearing her modified environmental suit. She had refused medical attention and ignored protocol to deliver her report immediately. The data was too important to wait for proper channels and administrative review. The evidence is conclusive, Sarah said, gesturing to the holographic displays surrounding her. Kepler 442b was not naturally occurring death world. It was artificially created through terraforming experiments conducted by our own research division 67 years ago. Dean Korath, an ancient eternal whose species had founded the Academy 2 millennia ago, leaned forward in his chair. His voice carried the weight of cosmic authority when he spoke. Miss Chen, you are making extraordinary claims. Do you have extraordinary evidence? Sarah activated the recovered data files. The auditorium filled with images from the lost expedition, Kepler 442b as it had been before the terraforming disaster. Lush forests, clean oceans, diverse wildlife, stable weather patterns, a garden world that would have been considered a paradise by any galactic standard. These are authenticated records from Research Expedition 77 Alpha, Sarah continued. The mission was classified at the highest levels, which is why there's no public record of it. They were testing new techniques for atmospheric modification and biological adaptation. The images shifted to show the terraforming equipment in operation. Massive atmospheric processors releasing experimental compounds into the air. Biological laboratories developing new strains of microbial life. Deep core drilling operations designed to stabilize geological activity. The initial results exceeded all expectations, Sarah said. The atmospheric modifications increased oxygen content by 12%. The experimental organisms were successfully converting toxic compounds into useful nutrients. The geological stabilization prevented natural disasters. Professor Veltar's form had turned completely transparent, a sign of shock in his species. If the experiments were successful, what caused the current conditions? Sarah's expression hardened. Cascade failure. The atmospheric modifications triggered unexpected chemical reactions. The experimental organisms mutated beyond their original parameters. The geological interventions destabilized tectonic systems they didn't understand. New images appeared. Time-lapse recordings of the planet's transformation. Forests dying as the atmosphere became toxic. Oceans turning acidic as the modified organisms consumed everything in their path. Volcanic eruptions triggered by deep core drilling that had weakened the planet's crust. The research team tried to reverse the process. Sarah continued. They had 67 days between the first signs of cascade failure and total environmental collapse. They failed to stop it. What happened to the research team? Asked Dr. Yilm, the Academy's chief biologist. They died on the surface trying to fix what they had broken. The last data files show them working until the very end, attempting to develop countermeasures for the environmental disaster they had created. The auditorium erupted in whispers and concerned discussion. Several faculty members were reviewing the data on their personal devices, confirming Sarah's claims through independent analysis. The implications were staggering. Dean Korath called for silence. Miss Chen, you have presented disturbing evidence of a historical disaster. But what does this have to do with your current mission parameters? Sarah smiled grimly. Because Kepler 442b isn't unique. I've spent the last 72 hours cross-referencing the recovered data with Academy classification records. 23% of all known death worlds show similar signatures. Atmospheric compositions that suggest artificial modification. Geological patterns consistent with deep core intervention. Biological systems that appear to be corrupted versions of standard terraforming organisms. The silence returned, deeper and more unsettling than before. Sarah let the implications sink in before continuing. We've been running away from problems we created ourselves. Every time our terraforming efforts failed, we classified the results as natural death worlds and marked them as too dangerous to study. We've been avoiding the evidence of our own mistakes for centuries. Professor Thek, the Academy's expert on planetary engineering, stood up slowly. His insectoid form was trembling with agitation. Miss Chen, are you suggesting that galactic terraforming efforts have been fundamentally flawed? I'm not suggesting it, Sarah replied. I'm proving it. The same technologies, the same techniques, the same assumptions that failed on Kepler 442b are still being used today. We're creating more death worlds every time we try to make hostile environments safe. Dean Korath's ancient features showed deep concern. What do you propose we do with this information? We need to study the death worlds instead of avoiding them. We need to understand what went wrong and how to fix it. And we need to do it with personnel who can survive in hostile environments long enough to gather meaningful data. The risks, Professor Veltar began. The risks are manageable, Sarah interrupted. If you know how to manage them. The problem isn't that death worlds are too dangerous to study. The problem is that we've been studying them wrong. She gestured to her modified equipment, the jury-rigged systems that had kept her alive for 3 days in conditions that would have killed most galactic species within hours. Standard Academy protocols assume that environmental suits will function perfectly and that evacuation is always possible if something goes wrong. Those assumptions are wrong. Equipment fails. Rescue missions aren't always feasible. If you want to study death worlds, you need people who can survive when everything goes wrong. Dr. Yilm leaned forward. Are you suggesting that humans are uniquely qualified for this type of research? I'm suggesting that humans are better adapted for it than most species, Sarah replied. We evolved on a death world. Every human colony exists in conditions that would terrify other species. We're not better because we're superior. We're better because we're used to it. The discussion that followed lasted for hours. Faculty members argued about risk assessment, academic protocols, and the ethics of sending students into dangerous environments. Some called for immediate suspension of all terraforming projects pending a complete review. Others demanded independent verification of Sarah's data. But underneath all the academic debate, a new understanding was emerging. The galaxy's approach to hostile environments had been fundamentally wrong. Instead of adapting to dangerous worlds, they had tried to eliminate the danger through technology. When that failed, they had simply avoided the problems they couldn't solve. Professor Veltar finally called for order. Miss Chen, assuming your analysis is correct, what would you recommend as our next course of action? Sarah had been waiting for this question. We need to establish a new research program. Death World Studies, staffed by personnel who can survive in hostile environments for extended periods. The mission wouldn't be to make these worlds safe. It would be to understand them as they are. And you believe humans would be ideally suited for such a program? I believe humans would be essential for such a program. Not because we're better than other species, but because we're different. We've adapted to survive in conditions that most galactic civilization considers impossible. Dean Korath stood slowly, his ancient form radiating the authority of millennia. Miss Chen, you have presented evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about galactic science and engineering. The Academy will need time to fully evaluate your findings and their implications. I understand. However, the Dean continued, your performance on this mission has been unprecedented. You not only survived conditions that should have killed you, but you thrived in them. More importantly, you discovered information that could reshape our understanding of planetary engineering. Sarah waited. She could sense something important coming. The Academy is prepared to offer you a unique position. You would lead the development of new protocols for Death World research. You would have access to resources and personnel necessary to investigate these failed terraforming sites. And you would have the authority to recruit specialists from any species you deem appropriate for this work. Sarah felt her heart racing. This was more than she had hoped for. Not just validation of her survival on Kepler 442b, but recognition that the entire galactic approach to hostile environments needed to change. I accept, she said. As the faculty meeting concluded and the auditorium began to empty, several professors approached Sarah with questions and concerns. But one conversation stood out from the rest. Zixth, her Velkari classmate, waited until the others had left before approaching. Sarah, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me since you returned. What? You could have died on that world. Your equipment failed multiple times. You were completely alone in conditions that terrify most of the galaxy. Why did you seem so comfortable? Sarah considered the question. How could she explain that danger was relative? That what seemed impossible to him felt manageable to her? Zixth. What, 6 months later, Sarah stood in the newly constructed Death World Research Facility, watching as the first class of volunteers completed their final equipment checks. The facility itself was a marvel of adapted design, built to withstand the kind of environmental extremes that would shut down most galactic installations. The students weren't what anyone would have expected from an academy program. 3 humans from different colony worlds, each bringing unique survival skills developed in their home environments. 2 Korthak, whose species had evolved on high-gravity volcanic worlds. A Velkari named Zixth, who had specifically requested transfer to the program despite his species' reputation for avoiding physical danger. Even a brave ethereal who had somehow convinced the review board that gaseous beings could contribute to hostile environment research. Final equipment inspection in 30 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her position through demonstrated competence rather than academic credentials. Remember, this isn't standard academy gear. Everything has been modified based on lessons learned from actual Death World operations. The environmental suits bore little resemblance to standard galactic equipment, built with redundant systems, improvised repair capabilities, and modularity that allowed for field modifications. The scientific instruments were ruggedized and calibrated for extreme conditions. The emergency supplies included multiple backup options for every critical system. Most importantly, the training had been completely restructured. Instead of theoretical preparation followed by practical application, Sarah's program started with survival training and built scientific methodology on top of proven survival skills. Students learned to expect equipment failure environmental hazards, and communication disruptions. They practiced improvisation, resource conservation, and emergency repair techniques. Zixth approached her station, his modified environmental suit looking strange on his tall Velkari frame. "Sarah, I need to ask you something before we deploy." "What is it? Are you certain this mission is necessary?" "We have enough data from Kepler 442b to understand what happened there. Why do we need to visit additional sites?" Sarah gestured to the holographic display showing their destination. Kepler 186f, another world classified as a natural death world for over 2 centuries. Recent analysis had revealed atmospheric signatures consistent with failed terraforming attempts. "Because Kepler 442b wasn't an isolated incident," Sarah replied. "Preliminary surveys have identified 47 worlds that show similar patterns. If we're right, that means 47 failed terraforming projects that were covered up instead of studied. 47 opportunities to learn from our mistakes. And if we're wrong," Sarah smiled, "then we'll learn something different. That's how science works." The mission briefing was unlike anything the Academy had ever conducted. Instead of detailed protocols and safety procedures, Sarah's team focused on adaptability and problem-solving. They discussed equipment failure scenarios, resource-sharing strategies, and emergency evacuation alternatives. They planned for situations where everything would go wrong simultaneously. "Remember," Sarah told her team, "the goal isn't to survive despite the hostile environment. The goal is to work effectively within the hostile environment. These worlds aren't trying to kill us. They're just being themselves. It's our job to adapt to them, not force them to adapt to us." The transport to Kepler 186f was conducted by a specially modified vessel crewed entirely by species adapted to extreme environments. The ship itself had been designed using principles learned from human colony ships, with redundant systems and the ability to function even after major component failures. As they approached the planet, the familiar signs of a death world became apparent: toxic atmosphere, extreme temperature variations, geological instability, and violent weather patterns. But Sarah's trained eye could see the artificial signatures hidden within the natural chaos. "Atmospheric analysis confirms artificial modification," reported Kesh, one of the Korthak students. "Chemical composition suggests large-scale terraforming operations approximately 140 years ago. Geological surveys show evidence of deep-core drilling in 17 locations," added Thyra, a human from the Proxima Centauri colonies. "The drilling patterns match hegemony engineering specifications from that time period," Sarah nodded. "Just like Kepler 442b. They tried to make this world safer and ended up destroying it instead. The landing was conducted with procedures that would have terrified traditional Academy personnel. Instead of a single landing site with maximum safety margins, Sarah's team deployed to multiple locations across the planet's surface. They planned to spend 2 weeks conducting comprehensive surveys, accepting the risks that came with extended exposure to hostile conditions. But something was different about Kepler 186f. As Sarah's team spread across the planet's surface, they began discovering something unprecedented. The terraforming disaster hadn't been complete. "Sarah, you need to see this." Thyra's voice crackled through the communication system. "I found a pocket ecosystem that survived the atmospheric conversion." Sarah made her way to Thyra's location, navigating carefully through the toxic landscape. What she found challenged everything they thought they knew about terraforming failures. A small valley, no more than a few kilometers across, contained a thriving ecosystem. The atmosphere was different from the rest of the planet, breathable by most galactic standards. Plant life flourished, water ran clean, and complex organisms had survived and adapted. "How is this possible?" asked Zixth, his scientific instruments reading atmospheric conditions that shouldn't exist on a death world. Sarah studied the data, her mind racing through possibilities. "The terraforming equipment, some of it is still functioning. They found the installation buried beneath a century of geological debris. Ancient atmospheric processors, still operational after all these years, maintaining a localized environment that preserved a fragment of what Kepler 186f had been before the terraforming disaster. But the most important discovery came when they accessed the installation's databanks. Unlike the corrupted records from Kepler 442b, these files were complete and intact. The terraforming didn't fail here. Sarah announced as the team gathered around her findings. It was sabotaged. The records painted a picture of scientific and political intrigue. Kepler 186f had been selected for terraforming, not because it needed improvement, but because it contained resources that certain factions within the hegemony wanted to exploit. The terraforming project had been used as cover for massive mining operations that destabilized the planet's ecosystem. When local scientists discovered what was happening, they had tried to stop the resource extraction. The response had been to accelerate the terraforming process, using experimental techniques that were known to be dangerous. The resulting disaster had been intentional, designed to cover up the illegal mining operations by making the planet too dangerous to investigate. This changes everything, Zixth said, staring at the data files. This wasn't scientific failure. This was deliberate environmental destruction. Sarah nodded grimly. And if they did it here, they probably did it on other worlds as well. Every death world could be hiding evidence of similar crimes. The implications were staggering. Not only had galactic civilization been creating death worlds through failed terraforming attempts, but some of those failures had been intentional cover-ups for illegal resource exploitation. The death world classification system hadn't been protecting dangerous planets from colonization. It had been protecting criminal operations from investigation. As Sarah's team completed their survey of Kepler 186f, they developed protocols for investigating other suspected sites. Each death world would need to be examined not just for scientific evidence of terraforming failure, but for signs of deliberate environmental destruction. The political ramifications would be enormous. Criminal charges against hegemony officials, reparations for damaged worlds, complete restructuring of terraforming oversight and environmental protection laws. But the scientific implications were even more significant. The pocket ecosystem they had found proved that terraforming disasters could be reversed given enough time and understanding. Some death worlds might be recoverable, others might contain surviving fragments of their original ecosystems. Sarah, Thyra said as they prepared to leave Kepler 186f. What do we do with this information? Sarah looked back at the valley where life had survived against impossible odds, maintained by ancient machines that refused to give up their purpose. We do what humans have always done. We adapt, we learn, and we fix what's broken. 3 months later, the Academy's annual review board convened to evaluate the Death World research program. Sarah stood before the assembled faculty and administration, presenting results that exceeded everyone's expectations. In 9 months of operation, the Death World research program has investigated 12 classified death worlds, Sarah reported. 7 showed evidence of failed terraforming projects. 3 showed evidence of deliberate environmental destruction. 2 contained recoverable ecosystem fragments. Dean Karath leaned forward. Miss Chen, what do you recommend as our next steps?